Hello, I'm Donal Macaulay and welcome to medicsvoices.com, where we talk to the key opinion leaders in health and medicine around the world. Today we're in Ireland and I'm talking to Mary Favier. Mary, you're one of the most influential doctors in Ireland. Tell me where it all began.
It began, I was mulling on this. When you asked me to do this, I was mulling on where did it begin? And I suppose I've had the trajectory of my career has been very much around advocacy and representing people and causes and trying to change things, trying to make them better, sometimes taking on difficult ones. And I think I had some fantastic teachers at school who really broadened our minds in terms of this was in Kerry in the Stone. And but when I went to college, I got involved in about every single society and project that could be involved. From the catering strike in first year, where somebody shoved a placard in my hand and said, "Stand there," and I didn't even know what it was about, through to COLOV and overseas development societies. And then I got involved in the women's group in UCC, which was a feminist group. And that made me a feminist activist, I think. And through then, as a junior doctor, as an intern, I got involved in the junior doctors strike back in the late 80s and was on the IMO GP committee. And I think that really got me, I became an activist advocate, involved in advocacy at that time. I think that's really where I started to realize that, yes, this is some of what I'm doing. And then, of course, that was all the more political, say, feminist stuff. But then I had the extraordinary fortune to get a job working with Michael Boland. And Michael, for those who would have known him, was and always has been the most eminent GP in Ireland, but also internationally. And for those involved in the Wonka project, he would have been president of World Wonka at one stage. And I had been traveling in Australia and in the States and done some work there and came back. And this will tell you how times have changed. I couldn't get a job. I did 2 weeks as an orthopedic SHO, to fill in while I got a GP locum job. These, how times have changed. But a friend of mine rang me up and said, I'm sitting here on the loo reading the Medical Times, and there's a job ad that might suit you. She said, the closing day is tomorrow. So I applied and I got this wonderful job. It was the first effectively educational fellow of the Irish College of GPs, working half-time in Michael's practice in Skibbereen and then half-time on educational projects with him in the ICGP. But as you know, he had the most wonderful mind and the most extraordinary intellect and the most extraordinary diversity of interests and opinions. And he mentored me, really, and he was a mentor through all my working days until he became unwell. And it was probably one of the most important things that happened to me. And it's one of the interests I have now is around the role of mentoring and encouraging and just giving people a leg up to the places you are yourself. So from there, I went into the college and I wrote educational materials. And funnily, one of them has come back full circle. I worked in Australia in an Aboriginal community. For those of you who saw the film Rabbit Proof Fence, it was a place called Jigalong. And I got an absolute insight into the healthcare of the Aboriginal community there, the indigenous community in Australia. And I was shocked. But as I came home, I realized, oh my, this is our situation with travellers and how the healthcare of travellers. So I asked Michael what he thought about writing an educational piece on travellers for GPs, and we did. And 25 years later, I was giving a talk on the same subject at Wonka, the rural Wonka in the University of Limerick last year. And one of the lecturers there, Patrick O'Donnell, saw it and said, could we do this again? Could we update it? It hadn't been done in 25 years. So we're just about to publish it as a QRG, a quality reference guide for the ICGP. So there's a lovely sort of turn there. I think Michael would have been proud of it.
Now, you've done terrific work in advocacy for women's health, and dating way back to 2002. Tell me a bit about that, but also doing that work in Ireland must have attracted a lot of flack, a lot of difficulty. It must have been a difficult time for you.
It wasn't always easy, but I had some great support. How it came about was when I was doing GP training, I did some voluntary work in the Rape Crisis Centre in Cork. So for 3 years, I worked there as a volunteer counsellor. This was in the days before the service was professionalised, as in the terms of psychotherapy, which was entirely appropriate. But we got wonderful training. And so I saw a good number of clients there. And it was the first exposure I had had to the role of the denial of abortion care in Ireland. And on from there, then into general practice. And so I developed an interest in it, but nothing more than the next person. And then in the 2002 referendum, which was around the role of suicide and trying to make sure copper-fasted that suicide couldn't be used as a reason to access abortion in Ireland. And we already had a constitutional ban, so it was a double lock. Myself and two other doctors were talking one day, complaining really about how the only voice you heard in the media from a medical point of view was a conservative voice, traditional voice, Catholic voice, almost always male voice. And we knew this wasn't the case. Here were three of us talking about it. And that's how Doctors for Choice started. There were three of us to start. And on from there, really. So there was, because we were the only medical voice there, we developed quite a role in the media, but we became a very important part of the growing advocacy movement. But it didn't really go anywhere for a long time. And for a number of years in the late 2000s, Doctors for Choice had become very small because there was no political change. And then one morning, a BBC reporter rang me at 7 a.m. asking me about the death of Savita Halappanavar. And I didn't know who she was. It had been on the front of the Irish Times that morning. And effectively on from there. And for 5 years, it became very, very busy. And it was a privilege to do it. I learned huge amounts. And yes, some of it was challenging. There was a whole sense for many, many years of being other in medicine, being other in general practice. And that was often a lonely path. But there were a number of us in Doctors for Choice who provided a lot of support to each other. And we ploughed on trying to put motions through the Irish College of GPs to get things changed, Irish Medical Organisation, all of them effectively unsuccessful, the Medical Council. I had sat on the Medical Council many years earlier and knew some of the ways around that. But yes, until the law was always going to change in Ireland because it was going to be a social movement and it had to come from the grass up. And that's effectively what did happen. And as we came through the campaign to repeal the Constitution in 2018, there was a decision made in the national advocacy campaigns that the two features of the campaign should be the patient's voice and the woman's voice, and the doctor amplifying that voice and providing background and context. And so that's really then became the pivotal role of Doctors for Choice as it was then. And we up and down the country, every meeting, every radio show, every TV show, right through until the launch of the national campaign of Together for Yes, which was the group of the eventually 70 organisations involved in it, on the Late Late Show, so myself and Peter Boylan, there were two doctors. And again, that was a decision of the national campaign to run it out with a medical voice. And in the end, it was very effective, and 2/3 of the population voted in favour. And the funny thing about all of that then was the doctors started to support the campaign very late, like 6 weeks out. But those that did became absolutely fantastic supporters of what became Doctors for Repeal, then Doctors Together for Yes, and then morphed afterwards into the START Providers Group, which is the Abortion Providers Group. And it was really funny. Everybody was exhausted after the referendum and fell down and fell over. And we were the people who had to get up again and start describing what the service should look like. And that was probably the big role that we had, in the sense that I had got involved in the years before that in Global Doctors for Choice. And they had asked me to join the board. It's based out of New York. And that was the most extraordinary opportunity to access academics, experts in the field of gynecology, in the field of abortion provision all over the world, all the people doing all the latest research. And I tapped into their most extraordinary network of up-to-date information, advocacy. And so we described a service where the abortion was going to be provided in primary care, in general practice. And it had been done in patches in places around the world, but never been done as a national system. So that's what we designed and described, and presented it for the year before repeal to everybody who'd ask us. And in the end, that was the system adopted. And that was really because we had described that if we replicated the UK system of clinics, there would be only 3 or 4 of them in Ireland, because they wouldn't be financially viable. And they would run the gauntlet of protests, and women would have an awful time having to travel to them. So yes, so the government accepted that as a concept, and it became what the service is today.
Let me ask you about another area that you're interested in and have worked in, because you've been on the Medical Council and you're on the board of one of the indemnity societies. So doctors get a lot of criticism, and indeed there's quite a lot of litigation against doctors in Ireland. Is that justified?
I would always try not to be afraid of criticism, or afraid of criticism of doctors. We have a lot to answer for. We're in sense of extraordinarily responsible positions, and I think we need to be open to interest in interrogation, whether you call it criticism. There is a disproportionate amount of litigation. People litigate for all types of reasons. We are second only to the state of California in the US in terms of actual numbers. Some of it is to do with our settlement size, but some of it is to do with the fact that there isn't a robust complaints procedure in Ireland. So every other country, for instance, in Europe, has robust multi-layered complaints procedures, whether it's from practice level to local area authority level up to national level. But in Ireland, we don't have that. And a lot of work I've done with the NPS is trying to actually address that gap, which requires changes in the Medical Practitioners Act. So you do see quite a lot of cases. And I think solicitors in Ireland would say that. What's interesting from my point of view, because I write a breach of duty reports for the indemnity organisations and the State Claims Agency, and sometimes for plaintiffs occasionally, is it's rare. People rarely take cases when something for nothing. It's always something bad has happened in terms of a very problematic outcome. What's the dispute, of course, is whether the doctor had any significant, whether it was a breach of duty or whether there was an avoidable error. And often there isn't, but people litigate it anyway. But to be fair to people, usually there have been, very difficult outcomes. So it's a very interesting area to work in. I don't do huge amounts of it. I do 1 day a week, but I just learn extraordinary amounts. So often I'm writing reports saying, oh boy, that could be us in our practice. And it's helped me introduce a very significant safety culture in our practice, and very much actively looking at how do you keep patient safety to the center and the fore. Because as we all know, it's all about the small things. It's the layering of small acts of safety that make the difference. Yeah, so it's been a very interesting, completely different sideline to everything else I do. And of course, I work in an area of high urban deprivation, so that's another whole sort of interest. But so the medical legal side is an unexpected one.
Now, as former president of the Irish College, on the Medical Council, on the board of the NPS, on the National Advisory Board for COVID, what is the position of women in medicine in Ireland?
Mixed. I mean, as we know, more than half of all medical school entrants are women. and graduates. However, we also know that they don't maintain that significant, number through the training years, but particularly into consultant posts. I think it's different in general practice. I think it's the flat structure, the lack of hierarchy in general practice, I think is very appealing to women. It's a specialty that I think is well suited to women and their style and thinking. There's a lot of evidence that women, practice safe medicine, going back to my earlier thing about patient safety. But I think there's significant amounts more to be done, which again comes to this mentoring issue. I think historically men have had much better networking opportunities, collegiate opportunities, opportunities just to be directed, well, why don't you apply for that, or why don't you review that or sit on that board? And there's a lot more work to be done. But I don't think it's just about women. I think the social class divide in medicine is really significant. And having come from a family that had no previous attendance in university from either parents or a wider extended family, and being something of a fish out of water when in college, and recognizing that it takes years in a way to gain back that traction. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of enabling those from less advantaged families. I mean, I have two young girls, young women now, and I recognize the privilege they have in their lives from the mentoring they can get from the likes of me, from the understanding of how the system works, and giving them guidance and direction. It's not unfair advantage. It's not pull. It's not nepotism, but it's coaching. And so many young women in particular from areas of disadvantage don't have that. And that would be the biggest area I would seek to address.
Now, my final question is, because you've had a number of awards, but the most recent award is, our recognition, I suppose, would be of 100 Women for 2024. So what's next on the horizon, Mary?
That was a funny one. There's a very funny story about that. My daughter, who's working in London at the moment, sent me a screenshot of it because somebody had sent it to her, and she couldn't get over that both her mother and CMAT, the musician, the young, fantastic Irish musician, were on the cover at the same time, and she was so chuffed. That, anyway, it's quite funny. So what's next? That's interesting. I've become interested in the issue of medicine in areas of social deprivation and urban deprivation in particular, and through the Deep End group, which, as people will know, started out of Scotland and looks at the social demography of this type of medicine, and the classic Tudor hat inverse care law, which is writ large in my practice. And that's where I can see my interests going more. I mean, I've had a lot of national roles. They happened by happenstance. And so, for instance, being the president of the college at the time of COVID and ending up on Nphet, the national emergency team, and representing general practice was such an extraordinary pivot from having been that doctor who was always other in abortion politics to now here I am leading the college and leading Irish general practice. And it was a privilege and a position I was really careful of, and always wanted to make sure I did the right thing and represented general practice appropriately, but always had an eye to that I was also representing my patients and our patients and those who didn't otherwise have a voice. And I'd like to think that was a way that, one of the roles I had. But funnily enough, you talk about I did a lot of media interviews and radio and television at the time. And the feedback I get all the time was that I was always so reassuring and, relieved anxiety, which I just think is so funny, considering, if you know me and my background, like relieving anxiety, reassuring, but that's always the feedback I've got from what my national role at the time, soothing around all the COVID anxieties.
Mary, it's been wonderful talking to you. As you know, I have huge admiration for your work. Thank you very much for everything you've done, and thank you very much for talking to us today. Thank you.
You're more than welcome. Thank you.